I'll make a quick announcement, and then I'll get John's beer. Hey everyone, welcome to Ethical Tech. Who's here for the first time? Right on. Great. So this is a monthly series we do, started about a year and a half ago, exploring the ethical implications of technology. If you've seen the meetup, you see that it's pretty broad, everything from social media and social movements to the ethics of algorithms to how race is treated in VR. Out of curiosity, I'd just like to ask at the beginning, like who sort of came for the technology part? If it's ethical tech, who came because they're technologists and technology? A couple folks, cool. Who came, halves? Who came for the ethics part? Okay, a little more. Who came for both? Okay, cool, yeah, let's see what happens. Yeah, okay,
Who came for something else?
A beer.
You did, actually you did. You came here last night and was not staying around, yes.
Thank you for staying.
Thanks to be here. Yeah, we're just excited to be doing an event with you, Greta. Thank you very much. Are you going to talk a bit about the Digital Equity Lab as well? And then to say as well, if there's, if this conversation, we keep it pretty low key. We'd like to keep it very informal. If there's a conversation that you want to have as part of this series later, please get in touch with myself, or if you know Greta, she can connect it and you can have that. Or if you need an event, basically we're a software consulting company that does these events around emerging technology and social and economic justice. So if you have an organization that does events around either of those, we're looking for space, we give it away for free. So come find me or connect. With that, I'll take it away. And, thank you.
Thanks so much, Duncan. I'm so pleased to be here. I'm going to introduce these lovely folks in a moment, but I'm just going to say a few words first about the Digital Equity Lab, who we are and what we do. So we're a university center at the New School. We're relatively new. It's myself and Maya Wiley, who's also the Senior Vice President for Social Justice at the New School. We co-direct the lab. And our mission is to advance digital equity through applied research, convening power, and policy strategy. So we're just getting started, and this is one of our first events. So we're really thrilled to be partnering with ThoughtWorks, and really excited to have these wonderful people here. And I also want to say thank you to Jolly from the Internet Society of New York City, who's running the live stream tonight, and hello to our elsewhere audience.
16 viewers.
All right, hello 16 viewers out there on the interwebs. All right, so I'm going to run down the line and just say your names, but I'm not going to actually give introductions yet to our panelists until it's their time to talk. But just quickly, this is Dhruv Mehrotra, Grayson Earl, Human Saberi, Darshana Narayan, and Ingrid Brington. And I'll talk a little bit more about who they are and what they're doing here in a moment. But I first wanted to know if anybody. All right, I'm gonna lob a heavy one at you. So get ready. And I mean, I think I just want to acknowledge how difficult this week has been, and how so many of us are really reeling with the news that's happening, and I think it intersects every part of our lives, and I just want to acknowledge it and tell you all that I feel like it's with us in the room, and that I hope that what we talk about tonight can be part of the work we have to do together. So starting there. All right, so this is heavy. Can anybody identify the really famous ethicist and philosopher who said this? Humanity exists in its greatest perfection in the white race. Whites contain all the impulses of nature and affects and passions, all talents, all dispositions to culture and civilization, and can readily obey as governed. They are the only ones who always advance to perfection. Great ethical figure. Not Nietzsche?
Kant.
Exactly. Immanuel Kant. So, do you guys know of Immanuel Kant, other things about him. His ethics, his morals. Anybody? Yes, no?
Please share.
I mean, what is there to say? Kant gave us the categorical imperative. He gave us the moral law. And Kant, like Locke and like Mill and like a lot of Enlightenment thinkers who we consider sort of the grounding of our ethical philosophy, or we might even say the infrastructure, the intellectual infrastructure of ethics, had a lot of sort of deeply embedded biases in the systems that they put out there. So I just want to start by opening that question of what are we talking about when we talk about ethics? Because I think there's been a lot of conversation recently around ethics and technology, and how do we create ethics in technology, and sometimes I worry that we're going to do it in a way that doesn't consider some of the flaws and biases that might be embedded in a tradition of ethics. So this evening is about rethinking ethics with intention. So, you know, the other thing this evening is about is infrastructure. And here comes Jolly.
Don't mind me.
Okay, we're not going to mind Jolly. So infrastructure is another place where biases and assumptions are often hidden and embedded. And so when it comes to technology, there's a couple of places I'll mention where we have hidden biases, or maybe not so hidden, but definitely embedded biases. So thinking about the internet and where it's good and where it's bad. There's a lot of studies out there. I'll just talk about a little bit about Bill Callahan and the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, who have mapped broadband systems and have demonstrated that where there's old copper line infrastructure, not fiber, and where ISPs don't maintain those systems or upgrade them, is almost geographically perfectly aligned with the areas that were redlined by the Federal Housing Administration in the 1930s. And so redlining was a federal policy which said that banks could not lend to people to get mortgages in these areas. And therefore, there weren't banks, there weren't grocery stores, and those areas have continued to suffer from, biases and sort of hidden flaws in the system. I could talk a little bit about platforms as infrastructure as well. We've all seen the consequences of what happens when Facebook becomes the infrastructure of our poll lists, of our public space of discussion. And so we really have what I would call a crisis in the infrastructure of technology. We have unintended consequences and policies that have led to the unchecked evolution of these kinds of biases that reproduce themselves because they're embedded in the infrastructure. And I would say that these are the unintended consequences of techno-libertarianism and market logic. So that is some framing for us as we begin tonight's discussion. And I have asked all these people to be here because they are imagining something different. And they're thinking about how we could build different kinds of infrastructure that respond to some of the problems that have been created through a legacy of techno-libertarianism and deciding what we're going to do via market logic alone. So first up, Dhruv Mehrotra, right here next to me. So you have your bio here, Dhruv. So Dhruv is an activist and an engineer who's interested in social justice, policy, and politics. And he's currently an artist in residence at I-Beam and a researcher at NYU Courant. Dhruv is also the network operator of Cell, which is an open source cellular network located in Nicaragua. So I'm going to ask each of these folks to talk about what they're doing in their work to challenge hidden biases in the infrastructure of technology, and in particular, how they're employing the principle of decentralization or distribution as a strategy. And so maybe if you don't mind talking about decentralization and then distribution.
Sure, yeah. So I'm Dhruv. Thanks Greta and ThoughtWorks for putting this together, and it's a cool panel. I mean, with friends, colleagues, and people whose work I really respect, so it's cool to be here. So I guess I should start by telling you a bit about myself. I'm a resident at IBeam and a researcher at NYU, and lately I've been describing myself as a skeptical technologist. That's someone who's skeptical of the promises of big technology, skeptical of the people who make it, and skeptical of the fact that that anything built in a world that's inherently violent and unequal will do anything but kind of reproduce those same conditions. So the work that I'm doing, and I think that I'm here to talk about, is my work building community networks. So I'm the network operator of a open source cellular network in Nicaragua. We work closely with the Caribbean, on the Caribbean coast, which is a politically autonomous or semi-autonomous from Nicaragua, to provide a cellular service to people who the market sort of forgot and neglected. And then the other network I'm working on is the Othernet, which is a community network in Bushwick, but in reality it's not really a community network. It's we're not trying to necessarily provide cheap access to the internet for everyone in the community, even though this does actually do that. It has, we're able to provide access. But the real question we're trying to explore is are there uses for the local area network what are the uses for the local area network? What are the possibilities there? Can we build software applications locally that can solve problems that the wide area can't or shouldn't?
So Dhruv, can you talk a little bit about mesh networks and what that is as an infrastructure and how it's decentralized?
Right. So the network we're building in Bushwick is a mesh network. It's basically the idea with the mesh network is that there's no real hierarchy of nodes. Each computer or each server or each part of the network will store and forward traffic around, so it's more resilient to consolidation or to the network being cut off by one node being shut off, which is a sort of different architecture than all internet services typically are.
Yeah, so I think there's been this kind of idea since maybe around sort of Arab Spring time that we could use mesh networks to kind of resist authoritarianism, because if you have a decentralized network architecture, then maybe there isn't a sort of authoritarian or central power that could control or shut down the system, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is one example, and Dhruv's work is starting to bring that principle to Nicaragua and to Bushwick.
Right. Yeah, and I think with the promises of mesh are that it's more democratic, and it's also easier to if you can get cheap access to backhaul to the wide area, you can distribute that more easily. But I also do want to talk about the promises of mesh. We talk a lot about mesh and as the savior of internet and network topology, and I don't necessarily know if that's true. I don't think that I feel you can mesh your network all together as much as you want, but the network won't fully be decentralized until you take into account the people who are actually creating the network and the people on your team and the people you're working with.
Okay. So. Great. All right. Great. Next on the line we have Grayson Earl, who has a diverse technological practice unified by a political approach to media arts and he employs video games, video projection, algorithmic audiovisual generation, biological organisms, and robotics to intervene on physical spaces and entrenched ideas. And I'm asking him to talk about a project which has this idea of decentralization at its core, which is bail block. So thank you so much, Grayson, and could you talk to us about what you're doing with bail block and what kind of infrastructure it is?
Yeah. On the note of infrastructure, I think it's important to talk about some of the ideas that inspired the project, including something super relevant to what we're talking about today, which was the SETI at Home project, which I think happened in 1999. I could have some of these details wrong. The Berkeley branch of SETI, which is the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, that was founded by Carl Sagan and Frank Drake. They kind of had a funding problem because the market wasn't really interested in the ideas that they were trying to achieve. So they couldn't afford a supercomputer to crunch the data that was coming from the satellite array that was kind of like searching outer space for various things that could indicate that there's intelligent life or something. And so what they did was they created this software called SETI at Home that you could download as a volunteer, and it would use your idle computer time to take in that raw data from the satellite array, crunch the numbers into a usable format for researchers at Berkeley, and then send it back to them. And since thousands of people downloaded this software, they effectively created this ad hoc supercomputer. And I always thought that was really interesting because this question about infrastructure, what is it? Well, it can also mean kind of the relationships that we have with one another, right? And through those relationships, they created something, materially effective. And then in 2010 or so, I was really interested in cryptocurrency just as a kind of a, just thought experiment. And so I was sort of learning about mining and all this stuff. And I was working at a computer lab, and so I installed some mining software that would run while no one was using the computers for a couple of weeks. And this was when it wasn't really worth anything, so it wasn't as like shady as it sounds. And sort of did this for maybe 2 weeks or something and mined like 2 Bitcoin, which at the time was worth like $10, and today is like $15,000 or something like that. I think I don't have it anymore. But it stayed in the back of my mind as like a really interesting idea of how to kind of like generate financial resources out of thin air. And so after Trump was elected, I was thinking a lot about how technology had failed us, as we were kind of alluding to recently, Facebook and the political siloing of ideas. Like the internet was supposed to counteract the exact kind of thing that we're now dealing with because people mobilized on that platform. And so I just kind of hit on the idea to sort of combine these two ideas of cryptocurrency mining and SETI at Home, essentially, and then teamed up with the New Inquiry and several collaborators, including Drew. And we kind of decided to orient this distributed cryptocurrency mining software we call Bail Block, such that it is paying bail for people in New York City, and then it's going to expand to people just around the United States. There was this New York Times op-ed that came out, I think it was called The Bail Trap, although there are 2 articles and I always forget which one it was. But it talked about how our justice system has as a basic assumption that most people won't take their cases to trial. Like the vast majority of people won't take their cases to trial because they can't afford bail. And so they'll get a plea bargain, right? So the DA will say, okay, well, how about you take a guilty plea and then we'll let you off with a little bit of jail time or no jail time. And everyone will take this, or many people will take this because they can't afford the average bail of like $910. And if even twice the amount of people could afford this amount, the justice system would collapse under its own weight because there wouldn't be enough judges or courtrooms in the United States to hear these cases. They're already hearing these cases at midnight on Friday night. And so it would necessarily impact policing because they wouldn't be able to continue to arrest people the way that they do. And so Bail Block has this lofty idea of providing that money to people who need it, and then sort of toppling prison industrial complex, one sort of community at a time.
Just like a small goal.
Yeah. And of course, in practice, it's not as effective as that, as we would love for it to be. But it does have the potential to. You can download this application, Veilblock, and then if you run it in the background of everyday computer use, it will be contributing to this mining project. And we take 100% of the cryptocurrency that is generated and give it to our partners at the Bronx Freedom Fund. We're also going to be working with immigration bonds really soon to counteract ICE. And we just give it to them to administer and just straight up pay bail for people. So that's the general idea with that project.
Thank you so much. All right, so Human Saberi, next on the line, he is the Deputy Director of the Resilient Communities Project for RISE New York City. And in this role, he's helping to build resilient community wireless networks, also mesh, in Sandy-affected areas of the city in partnership with local businesses, civic organizations, and residents. Shout out to Clayton Banks over here from one of the partner organizations, Silicon Harlem. So, Human, can you talk to us about what are you doing building infrastructure? What are you doing building infrastructure? And, and how does decentralization come into it?
Of course. So thank you everyone for joining us here today. Thank you to ThoughtWorks for creating the space for us. Before I start, I do want to extend a special thank you to Greta. You've truly been a leader and a very prescient voice in the field of digital equity and community networking, and I don't know how many other fields as well. So maybe. So yes, let me tell you a little bit about the work that we're doing with resilient communities. So as Greta mentioned, we are building community-owned Wi-Fi networks in 5 neighborhoods that were Sandy impacted across the city. So we're in Hunts Point, we're in East Harlem, we're in Sheepshead Bay, we're in Gowanus, and we're in Far Rockaway. And so what we're doing there is building these networks using small businesses as the nodes throughout each neighborhood. And as part of this work, what we've done is each organization has hired one individual who acts as a community coordinator. We've trained one individual per organization on our sort of curriculum and our pedagogy for digital stewardship. So what this involves is working with these community coordinators to do trainings of local residents in each neighborhood in a fashion that's non-hierarchical, that's meets the learners, the digital stewards, sort of where they're at, engaging them on their own terms so that they're demystifying technology. And really the digital stewardship really isn't so much necessarily about tech, although there is the hardware and software components of networking that we train the stewards on, but it's also about community organizing, relationship building, outreach. And so this really gets to, I think what Grayson just sort of mentioned now about social infrastructure. We sort of view the digital stewards as the social infrastructure that sort of binds the communities that we're working with the actual technology, with this mesh network. And I think we were talking a few days ago, and Ingrid had mentioned that I guess Mark Zuckerberg had put this 6,000 word essay up about, and he invoked social infrastructure.
It was a little after the election, and it was like about like building community, and he uses the phrase like social infrastructure like 30 times without ever explaining what that means.
Yeah.
I mean, I think he just meant Facebook.
As I was reading it, I was trying to see, like, okay, what is he trying to say?
So sorry.
No. I got 2 paragraphs in, and I was like, this milquetoast manifesto is not for me. I can't reading this.
Milquetoast manifesto.
But what we're looking at here with social infrastructure, it is about relationships, but to add more to it, I would say it's about sort of the positive and healthy relationships of trust between humans, between like residents in these communities that can sort of foster these collaborative problem solving in a respectful manner. That's really what we're trying to do with digital stewardship. And in the process, you're empowering each of the stewards with these new skills. They are now they have now built, they will be building, we're going into installation this summer, we're very excited. But at the end of the summer, they will have built their own piece of the internet that's theirs. They'll have a local server for local content hosting. And that sort of ties into some of these hidden biases in our infrastructure, which treats our usage of the internet as consumers, right? Not as producers. We're not producing anything. And I was recently in Detroit, and I was taking a tour of the local networks that one of our that's basically our sister project in Detroit. You should all look up the Detroit Community Technology Project if you haven't already. But basically, this project, this group is implementing a project called the Equal Internet Initiative (EII), and it's a similar model. They're doing digital stewardship, working with residents, and one of the tech trainers that we met in Detroit had this really interesting comment about how our upload and download speeds are basically structured to force us into being consumers. And so I was looking into that a little bit more, and so you look at what the FCC broadband definitions were in '96. So in 1996, the definition of broadband was 200 kilobits per second down and 200 kilobits per second up, so 1-to-1 ratio. We go to 1996, and the FCC changes that definition to 4 megabits down and 1 megabit up. So we're skewing the ratio towards being a consumer by 4 to 1. And then in 2015, that goes to 25 down and 3 up. So
Maybe, not for long.
and maybe not for long, if we're lucky. But that's still, regardless of even if this FCC doesn't change it, we're still in this situation where our infrastructure, our download speeds are sort of programming us to just want to consume more and more. And I think with our work, we're trying to change that dynamic so people can actually produce and upload and share their stories.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to mention also with both Drew and the work that Human's talking about, that mesh networks also give you the option of turning off the internet if you want to. So you can either be on the global internet or you can just be local. It's up to the community itself. So in a way, it's like actually really decentralized in that way also. Great. So next we have Darshana Narayanan. And Darshana, I have lost where's your bio? Grayson, how did I do this? Okay, great. Darshana is a neuroscientist and a consultant, and she studies human behavior at multiple levels, which means both individual and organizational, and timescales, ontogeny, and evolutionary history. And she works on Polis, which is a crowd understanding platform used by governments, businesses, nonprofits, and communities for collective governance. So Darshana, can you please explain what ontogeny is? No, I'm just kidding. What was that?
Development.
Oh, okay, great. Did I say it right? Ontogeny?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess we'll hear my full story.
But, Darshana, we would love to hear from you. So we're talking a lot about decentralized systems, and one of the big questions that arises when you have something that's non-hierarchical or decentralized is, how do you govern it? How do you order it? Who's in charge of what? So if you could talk a little bit about your work on governance and how you approach decentralization, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna step back for just a minute and start with where it all came about. I study animal behavior as the ontogeny part might have led you to believe, and which means I've looked for a very long time at how the brain, the body, and the environment together in concert shape behavior. I worked for a very long time with non-human primates as an experimentalist, and now I work with human primates as an experimentalist. And I sort of started off in collaboration with Amadal Hedi, who's also a neuroscientist at Princeton, sort of thinking about how societal structures shape our behavior and shape our brain, our body, our behavior. And that is our environment. We're born into these structures. They very heavily shape everything we do. And through this work, we sort of started grappling with notions like progress or efficiency, these artificial terms that we have kind of made up and trapped ourselves within. And in many ways, sort of come to think of as natural, right? So people would go so far as to say, oh, survival of the fittest, the way nature works, capitalism is natural. You know, these sorts of jumps, which is, for the record, totally not the case. And as we went through this, we sort of started, we realized that we had a value system that was neither of us were objective. There's no such thing as objectivity, and this value system really matters. And so for everything we looked at, we started putting the value system front and center, be it China or Facebook or Java, the kernel of Java, whichever experiment it is, and started putting our value systems front and center. And it turns out that my value system is that I would really like to see a future of a plurality rather than the singularity, which is how I think about decentralization, which is really going after strongholds of power, breaking down those strongholds, distributing power, balancing power, and figuring out how we can govern ourselves. And I must give credit for the comparison to Origin who came up with the plurality singularity comparison. And so in sort of thinking about how to do this or figuring this out, I've started like going out into the field and meeting people and questioning and figuring out how experiments that are already succeeding at doing this have succeeded at doing it. And there are a couple of really remarkable places that have completely restructured entire countries by introducing decentralized participatory methods, or trying to, it's not complete decentralization yet, but definitely making more and more space in government for citizens and civil society. And two big experiments, one in Taiwan. In 2014, they had a movement that really did open up space in government for a lot of experimentation. It was called the Satna Movement. They sort of squatted legislative chambers for a month and demonstrated to the government what they wanted a participatory democracy to look like. And the government was sort of shamed into making a deal with them and opened up space for large-scale participatory governance within their central government. So they now have a very elaborate and very adventurous, I would say, process for citizen governments together to collaboratively craft legislation, programs, policies at a national scale. And citizens, they're part of the task force that sets up the process. They have the power to change the process itself. And for every issue that comes on the table, all of the stakeholders are invited to the table. Whether it's private sector, public sector, civil society, government, and everyone comes as equals and collaborates to craft the future of their country. They have regulated Uber. This way, they're one of the very few countries that hasn't had a problem with Uber because they got ahead of this problem. They have sort of put up legislation to govern or to figure out what to do with revenge porn, which has been a bit of a deal. So you can imagine a whole country sort of having deliberation of what even revenge porn means, right? What intimate images means, things like that, which they did. They have regulated unmanned drones this way. They've also built some amount of social infrastructure. Their tax platform was co-created with citizens and government. Spain is another big example. After their Indignados with the 59 movement, they have political parties both at the local and the national level that really fully embrace participatory democracy. So Madrid, for example, has this platform called the CD Madrid, where citizens put up proposals for what they would like to see in the city, and everybody votes on it, and then the city council carries it out. It is that they're not questioning what comes at the top, they are enacting the will of the people, or carrying out the will of the people. And they've redesigned, town squares, physical infrastructure using this method, but also co-created their human rights sort of charter for the city using their participatory methods. There are many these sort of examples like this happening. Jolie just sort of introduced me to something that's happening, or something that works in the a decentralized governance model on the internet that the Internet Corporation for Assigned Numbers and Names uses, which is very elaborate and quite incredible. And for all of these things, if you want that many people in a decision-making process, you need good tech. And it's necessary, that tech matters. So some of what I do is help build this tech. And a platform that was created after Occupy, so we can listen at scale without these hour-long processes, without the pain of it. is being used in a number of different countries, and I'm helping build out this platform. It's called Polis, and you go on the platform. Whoever sets up a conversation around the issue in Taiwan, it's their citizen government task force. There are a couple of statements there. You either agree, disagree, pass on the statements, and if you don't see your sentiment reflected, you put in your sentiment, and then the next round, the next set of people get to see your sentiment and vote on it, and then the conversation just keeps sort of generating itself. And in real time, there's a machine learning algorithm that both surfaces these statements, but also visualizes and churns through the information, showing opinion groups, showing areas of consensus and divisiveness. So all of this information can be taken in without it being sort of overwhelming for whoever the human or humans are who are orchestrating this, or kind of the task force taking care of this to digest it. And the platform is being used in a couple of different places, Singapore, Taiwan, a bunch of different places. It will be used in New York City very soon, which will be really great.
Great, thank you so much. Great, okay, so I'm gonna introduce Ingrid Burrington. And I don't know how I keep losing these bios, but whoops, now I'm losing my papers. Ingrid is an expert on infrastructure, which is not in her bio, but I'm gonna say it anyway. And thank you. She writes and makes maps and tells jokes about places, politics, and the weird feelings people have about both. She wrote the book, Networks of New York, an illustrated field guide to urban internet infrastructure. And sometimes she gives tours. If you're really, really lucky, maybe someday you'll go on a tour with Ingrid to see infrastructure. So I'm going to ask you, Ingrid, to reflect on some of what you've heard. We've heard about decentralized infrastructure in terms of network infrastructure, distributed information architecture, the blockchain, governance, and movement building. So that's a lot of different kinds of infrastructure that all touch technology in different ways. And so, yeah,
Okay,
please.
cool. Thank you, Greta, for having me. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for the live I'm also always a little bit humbled, like, being last year, because, like, I mostly just write, and, like, these are all, like, you know, very distinguished and accomplished, like, makers of things and organizers, and, like, the thing that I do is, like, largely document and write about and try to, I mean, frankly, like, when I started doing this in 2013, 2014, I was kind of trying to make infrastructure interesting to people who would not otherwise care about it, because, you know, the familiar joke to all the infrastructure people is, you know, that infrastructure is this thing that, like, people only really care about if it's broken. And, like, there is a way, you know, even back in 2013, where there's sort of this instinctive understanding, like, something about the internet is broken in this, like, fundamental way that kind of feels maybe like a promise or something else, not necessarily like a busted cable. But simultaneously, like, the visual vernacular and a lot of the narratives around how people use the internet and interface with it and live with the internet tend to be very, like, myopic and tend to have a lot of really shitty metaphors and, like, even worse clip art. Like, a lot of what I feel like got, like what actually kind of got me down this rabbit hole was in 2013 when all the Snowden stories started dropping. Like, you have these really long, dense stories trying to, like, parse these, like, complicated government documents, and then you have these, like, stupid images. It's just like either like, you know, just like slide decks that, like, were kind of visually incoherent, or like someone would, like, somebody on, like, a deadline would, like, go into Shutterstock and search, like, surveillance and, like, get a picture of a lock and some ones and zeros and some, like, matrix banner sort of shit. And I remember thinking at the time, like, I don't know what the internet looks like. It probably doesn't look like this. And the thing about going kind of into the field and trying to, like, see infrastructure is that it becomes really abundantly clear how many people you need to make it work. Like, probably my best sources for working on the field guide as a book were people working in open manholes in New York City, like, just going up to beat, like, Verizon trucks or whatever in the middle of the night, because nobody thanks the people who do that work, and, like, they keep the internet running, basically. And like, give, like, they're more than happy to like. I mean, it also helps that I'm like a small girl. Like I think that there's like if I were, it's a little bit easier for me to be like, what you doing? And kind of play dumb. But I think generally the work that is like underappreciated in like how the internet operates is like some of the most interesting work. I'm going through like some of the stuff that came up in the conversation, just taking a lot of notes. I guess within that, like, one of the things that I think is really great about the work that Drew and Human have been doing is the way in which that organizing and the training and pedagogy really challenges the assumption of kind of like who is the tech worker and who is the like kind of like expert. I think the legacies of like how we like the legacies of looking especially like sort of like computer history and like internet history tend to like really emphasize like those like single guys like in either like Mark Zuckerberg in his dorm room having like a super wicked cool idea. He was in Boston, so maybe he would have said wicked. Or like the image of like the singular sort of genius, like Steve Jobs alone in his like turtleneck or whatever, or like the guys at like Xerox PARC in their fucking beanbag chairs. So like the people who are absent from those stories are like the millions of people required to like operate Apple's supply chain to make the iPhone work, and absent from the mythos of Mark Zuckerberg are like the millions of content moderators. Well, it's more like tens of thousands, but they love it to be less. But I think you get my point, and I think one of the things that I love about the work of building local networks and the ways in which also like the like thought and care that goes into the pedagogy, especially with the resilient community stuff, is the ways in which it really demonstrates that like you need all of the expertise, and it is all valued at the same level. It's not like you're the one who knows how to code, therefore you're like the hero of the fucking story. It's more like a richly populated RPG. And
It does feel that way sometimes.
should I say more things, or am I?
I think that was great. I think that what I want to do is I want to open it up for you folks to ask questions. I am going to ask you to ask questions, and with a question mark on the end of them. There's a couple of things that I just want to throw out there to think about as you formulate your questions. First of all, I want you to think about, so we've heard about some really principled, ethical, if we can still use that word, work that's happening led by these folks. I want to just think about this idea that decentralization and distribution, right, is a principle that we've heard them all talk about. But I want to ask, what's the flip side of distribution or decentralization? So what might be an unintended consequence that we're not thinking about if we just take decentralization as a good quality, a good design quality, and one that will help us route around authoritarianism, for example? What are we not thinking of? Is it possible that creating decentralized systems could actually split us into different realities? Like if our reality more and more becomes sort of defined by the information we're consuming, is it possible that we could have communities with their own infrastructure, which is defined by really great social values, and communities with their own infrastructure that's defined by really terrible, what we might consider really terrible social values? And I also want to think about another point is that we have to think about what we should do to avoid those unintended consequences. So if you have questions about how to do that and how these folks are thinking about avoiding unintended consequences in their work, that would be great. And also, if you have a question about a term you didn't understand or a concept that was unclear, please feel free to ask those questions. I think sometimes those can be the very best questions because we're all talking about pretty complicated stuff. So, with all of that, does anybody want to lead us off with a question? Or does anybody, oh, Clayton Banks wants to lead us off with a question.
So I'm gonna just try to be sort of practical,
Yes.
and I'm a corporate business-minded kind of guy versus a nonprofit sort of thinking. So the challenge that I have often with mesh speaking, if you will, is the sustainability. When I look at the future, and so I do have a question for Uma and whoever wants to answer it. When I think about the future, I think about everyone being connected and everything being connected. And I'm curious if this movement around mesh is going to take all of that into consideration when you look at infrastructure. Infrastructure is the same as it was when America started. The idea behind infrastructure is to make our lives better. And the great news now is we got better tools to do it. The question I want to ask is, the infrastructure that I've been hearing on this panel, or at least some of it, is sort of thinking about mesh and democratized broadband in some ways, and everyone has a stake in it and all that kind of stuff. In my value system, it makes a lot of sense, but from a business perspective, I'm thinking when we have autonomous cars and we have city tech-enabled devices and all types of things going on, there's a certain amount of need, I think, to have real money behind that. I think there's got to be real money behind our smart bridges and smart streets that are coming. So I'm curious if that could be one of the drawbacks, if you will, Greta, to your point about, is there a sort of unintentional consequence, is that those neighborhoods today that don't have broadband, those neighborhoods today that do lack great infrastructure, stay in that space because the world keeps moving faster and faster. So Human, you might want to approach that. Do you think about
I feel like
the
Ingrid looks moved.
sustainability of mesh networks, or anybody?
I mean, so I thank you for your question, and I kind of want to start by disputing the statement that that the idea around building infrastructure is making people's lives better. Insofar as state constructed infrastructure is often, it is also it's like, yes, it can make people's lives better, but it's also kind of an instrument of defining social order, right? Like the U.S. interstate system was like, it was like the national authorization for Defense and Highways Act. Like it was a military-driven initiative related to the Cold War. And that's not to say that it's not helpful, but it's I think maybe in thinking about what the economic model would look like, there's also the question of if you had the will to have state investment in it, trying to understand what's in it for a government. I don't really know if I trust this present government to commit to supporting infrastructure in a meaningful way. I think we've had 4 infrastructure weeks in the last 2 years that are really not much, and also to continue to exist. That's maybe helpful. But I think in terms of why infrastructure gets built, I think it's important to consider that it's not solely just we have good intentions, right? The fact that it doesn't meet some people is kind of evidence of that.
Well, it's completely been, all 3 industrial revolutions have created inequity. I get that.
Yeah.
That's clear. I mean, I've seen neighborhoods on the wrong side of the track only because of infrastructure. That is an issue of who is at the table for designing,
Yeah.
to Darshana's point, which has primarily been men with nice degrees, men that grew up in suburbs, men that have, cars and garages, men like me. That's how I grew up. And that's how I designed from an engineering perspective, not because of anything except that's my prism. So I get the fact that there's infrastructure bias, which is why I came here. The question is, what are we going to do about this next 4th industrial revolution where all of our infrastructure has to be upgraded? Will it be designed the same way in the past to create divides? Or can we have Yashan and Greta and Human and everybody at the table, and poor people and rich people and everybody come together and say, how do we make sure that this infrastructure is going to make our lives better and equitable for everybody?
Right, and I think
Human
if you
looks
want
ready.
to, as you're talking about IoT, the Internet of Things, and all the connected things that are going to, mushroom up in the city, it's still going to run on a base level of connectivity and internet connectivity. And I think with our work, demystifying that connectivity and like laying down the building blocks for like what the internet is, how it works, and how you can build it yourself is that sort of first positive step to getting people ahead of that curve. Because you're right, you don't want to constantly be chasing the things that have developed years ago. And so I think being as inclusive as possible is a way to mitigate against any sort of like unintended consequences that we're looking at, because one person's unintended consequences and others' lived experience, right? So
I would add to that I think it really helps to have pressure on civil society, like the threat of people sort of rising up and making a fuss, not to beat the revolution drum immediately, but it does help. It keeps the pressure on, and that's what allows space.
Yeah, and then I guess to combine both of those things, right, where we're filling in the knowledge gap means that you can actually apply smarter and more directed pressure as well, right? The more you can actually educate people about the right demands and the most targeted demands, the more you can fight that, the infrastructure gap that you're talking about.
With a decentralized pedagogy, each community group, like what I would love to see is like each of these 5 be training another 5 communities each, so that slowly the work that's just these sort of 5 separate islands of connectivity around, like locally built and owned connectivity around the city, are spreading and linking up with each other.
And that's right. Like I just to put a little cherry on top of that, it's like I'm hiring a digital steward who's been trained by Human's group to train the stewards that I'm training as well. So this stuff is actually happening, which is interesting.
Infection.
Yeah.
It's a contagion. Yeah.
Yeah, that's an awesome point, and it connects to organizing. And part of what Ingrid mentioned, I think the word you were pointing at is labor. I mean, the labor that undergirds the entire system, but then also sort of the question I have is how do you, taking this Sunday of education and decentralization, and how do you get people to be aware of their stake or their potential agency in these processes? So like, how do people become aware that they could participate, or that they that their participation and their engagement with these issues actually has some sort of agency?
Discotheques. They're Discover Technology sessions. So it's part of
That's a good idea.
No, but entertainment does help. Like so many of these events seem to be so boring. So boring. If there was food and entertainment, it was a party or a disco. People would show up. They're like, you have to, like, in some sense, like, seduce people into participating.
Totally. And that's what a discotheque kind of does. Is that like you have these Discover Technology sessions held in community organizations or places where individuals or residents of the neighborhood feel comfortable going to. These are spaces that are not alienating. They're ones they're familiar with. And you just sort of lay it all out. Like when we did one in Brownsville, and we did a demonstration of a portable network kit, which is something we've developed on our team, which is basically Wi-Fi in a suitcase. And so it really is just like a beautiful, clean, simple way to show how you can build your own piece of the internet.
I think a good example is how the Soviet Union introduced, introduced everyone to the industrial age with these really beautiful propaganda posters that were just like very artistic and had these fun slogans and gently sort of led everyone to before things went to shit.
Yeah, I think it's
Speaking of unintended, well, maybe they were exception. I don't know. But
No, it helps. It helps too.
yeah, it's true. Do we have other questions? Rory? Rory Solomon, everybody. For those of you whose names I don't know, please feel free to ask questions also.
Well, thanks for convening this, and thanks for the great talks. I want to ask a kind of like grumpy, skeptical question. If I can try to get my thoughts organized and try to bring a little bit of kind of like a dilated historical perspective. So, as a couple of you know, I've been studying mesh networks quite a bit, and somehow over the last few months, in my interest in decentralized networks and mesh networks, I've found myself really going deep in studying broadcasting. And if you get into kind of like the history of a lot of the same underlying technologies of mesh, like wireless radio communication and so on, I think you could identify a kind of symmetry over like maybe a 90 or 100 years kind of period where like, radio was invented in like 1890s, and the first couple decades were like very much what we would consider a decentralized communication network. It was two-way, peer-to-peer, ad hoc, insanity. People started broadcasting new stuff, and then 1927 was like essentially broadcasting, like the birth of like clamping that down. And so I think there's a certain symmetry now, like that we're seeing maybe shifting back, using radio technology to kind of attempt to kind of go back to this kind of other mode. So my grumpiness kind of comes in because if we think about other things that happened in that kind of like 90-year period, there's a lot of things like the accumulation of vast nuclear arsenals, mass society, globalized supply chain networks, and all these kind of other crazy social phenomena that maybe are kind of tied up in more like centralized information circulation networks. So like now, I think when we see these kind of shifts towards decentralization, my question for everybody is, how can we kind of like, are we ending up with this kind of like chicken with its head cut off kind of phenomenon where we have a kind of like mass networks of social organization, but without kind of the capacity for like a social cohesion around like coherent truths and the ability to like understand some of these or manage these massively large scale phenomenon. And so like thinking about decentralization, one of the people who's like really psyched out decentralization is like Steve Bannon. And he's been like studying like the history of the Catholic Church to really understand how decentralization can challenge a massive authority. He's trying to like actually like crumble like globalized networks. So like how do we work towards decentralization without encouraging these other kinds of like social crumbling and things like that? Is that a possible kind of thing?
I mean, I think it's a big question. But I mean, I think distinguishing between decentralization as a technology and decentralization as like, a social practice is an important thing to do, right? Like, I don't think you can build, the internet we want until we properly have a world that we want to be reflected in the internet, right? So I think there's two kind of threads to that conversation, right? I'm not sure if that made any sense, but.
Sort of add to something you said earlier is that, it's about the people and the intent that Al-Qaeda is a decentralized network, and that's what makes them the terrorists and makes it them so effective. And so you can have the same structure co-opted in multiple ways. But yes, it is it's tricky. How do we not slip into these modes is very hard.
Yeah, and I think for us, like, so I have a friend who's a physicist, and I saw him a few weeks ago, and he told me, when there's no foundational ideas, all ideas are good ideas. And I was like, okay. And then I thought about it, and I was like, oh my god, no, like, all good ideas need some solid principles behind them, otherwise you get all the, inane things that we see, apps that say yo, and like whatever, like all that crap. So, for us, what we do is we start from like what we did was we were inspired by the Detroit Digital Justice Coalition's work in crafting principles, and so we have our own sort of principles for our resilient networks, and it really focuses a common theme there is inclusion, so that you are bringing people in, and you are bringing like more and more voices to the table to build out something that you want.
Thank you for the question. And one thing, maybe just to add to, like, I don't know if this is just really even more bad, but a thing like that I've been thinking a lot about lately is and this is kind of tied into the question, like, who is the tech worker, is like the limits of trying to kind of like the ways in which the supply chain is sort of designed against the idea of like justice and equity, right? Like, Fairphone didn't really work. They did their best. For those who are, Fairphone was a project, are people familiar with this? There's a project to try and like build an ethically sourced phone because iPhones are full of blood and it's a problem. But like the point being like in thinking of how do you kind of build like how to actually build a computer that's like full of like equity and justice, like starting at the rocks, like requires actually maybe not a vast level of centralization, like that's one way to do it, like just having monopoly, like that's, I think, sort of what Apple's trying to do. They have a really tightly controlled supply chain, and they're trying to make it better, mixed results. But the other version is kind of just thinking about like how you change ownership of means of production across that supply chain, right? And think about like who is like managing and maintaining all of those pieces of the supply chain, but as it presently exists, and like, you know, Matt Hockenberry, who you know and who the rest of you should know, is much more eloquent on these things than I am, but and I'm probably just drawing on lots of clever things he said, but we shall just get drinks.
But I mean, I think that's a great question, and it's the question that I sort of started with, is that if we take decentralization as like a default good principle of design, right? And this is how we're going to change the internet for the better. This is how we're going to make the next internet, is to decentralize it. I think we do have this question about fragmentation and kind of loss of a central organizing principle. And, you know, I think Clayton's point is also well taken in terms of, you know, we risk having sort of tiers, right? We risk having some people who have access to driverless cars and amazing technology, like what all is out there? I don't know, flying stuff. Whatever. On the other hand, is self-determination and the ability to control, the technology that you interact with. Is that worth the price of kind of opting out? And then what about people who can't opt out? Because there are a lot of people who can't opt out. So I think, this is really absolutely like something we're not going to fix tonight, but a seed that I think that I want to plant for people who are working in this field to think about, with respecting the crucial role that people in technology are playing by organizing to create technologies that are not harmful, or refusing to participate in developing technologies that are harmful, right? So I think we all have to think about the unintended consequences, and that goes for decentralization as well as any other, surveillance tech or AI or any of that. You had a question right here.
Yes. Fairphone, is that like list Fairphone or like just FAR?
FAIR. The idea was, I think it was the Dutch guys. Please someone help me out if I'm getting this wrong. But they basically were trying to demonstrate that you could create a consumer market available smartphone where you could kind of trace the sourcing of all of the minerals that were used in it and vet the conditions of its manufacture and say basically no humans and or animals and or soil was harmed in the making of this smartphone. And audits of their processes, there are definitely gaps in how far they actually could manage and audit the supply chain because supply chains are murky. And I think it's a really admirable objective. It has limitations simply kind of by virtue of the way that the entire kind of manufacturing system has been constructed around it. Do you remember the names of the dudes who made that?
I didn't catch the name of the dude, but thank you for the Fairphone thing, which I haven't heard of and probably no one has heard of because,
Well, because and also it's I think not that many people. They didn't make that many. They didn't get that.
It's also definitely prohibitively expensive too.
Yeah, they're also really expensive. It turns out if you want to make a ethically sourced where everyone's getting treated well, it turns out it costs much more.
Just like fashion.
So I want to. I think that we're sort of at a limit of abstraction at this moment. So I want to take it home. Just have you guys just say one quick sentence, right? And so I think that I really want to think about this idea of scale, and that's sort of coming up in the question that Rory asked and the question that Clayton asked. So if we're talking about these kind of renegade, these little insurrections, these little sort of infrastructure insurrections, how do we do it at scale? Because obviously right now we're at a moment where we have to think think about scaling up all these things that we're doing that have a seed of resistance and of principle in them. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you have not been paying attention. So really, really quickly, what are you going to do to scale your work for the revolution?
Amen. What revolution?
The revolution.
The one that's going to happen. All right, or you can answer the question, what revolution? No, but I'm really interested in scale because I think it's a really fundamental question. I'll say that we had this conversation about a week ago at the Allied Media Conference, and I want to quote Diana Nucera, who said that radical solidarity is love scaled up. And that is how Diana Nucera is building wireless networks in Detroit. Does anybody want to go first? You guys don't have to
Well, I
put
was
on
going
the
to
line.
mention the Diana thing.
Oh, sorry about
but
that.
that's okay. You did, and you did it way better than I was going to do it, so I'm very grateful. So I'll just say yes, love, and two, just a lot of training and training of trainers and just building capacity and knowledge and understanding.
And being prepared. Like, don't wait for it to come up. Be prepared in advance and learn from people who've already done it before. Whether it's a movement or an uprising, what do they have to get in place? What infrastructure? You need internet connectivity, which is going to be blocked. You have to, get to a duxing or whatever it is. Food, and there are people who have tried this out, and we can. The nice thing is now the world is sort of, where we have the challenges but also the benefits of globalization. You can reach each other, learn from each other, make friends across paths, and I think that is super.
Seconding the solidarity thing, I think the expanding also kind of who within that struggle for building better tech is like part of that challenge, right? You were alluding, I think you were alluding to the recent sort of like attempts by tech workers to be like, hey, billionaire, maybe stop making the bad thing. And one of the things that I found really remarkable about those letters, because particularly the Microsoft Waste contract one, was that at no point did it mention, in it, that perhaps there are people who work for Microsoft who may be affected by this, right? Because the idea that there are janitors who clean the Microsoft campus who might have family in El Salvador, that somehow was not part of their expanded frame of why this might be a problem for Microsoft. And I think the idea of thinking who is in your kind of who are your people in this struggle, and how do you bring everyone who has a stake in this, and everyone who's kind of touched by this kind of behemoth system to the table is a piece of trying to solve that puzzle. And also maybe just having a power analysis, because with the Amazon letter, nobody who works at AWS signed that fucking letter. They're screwed.
Who signed it?
It was product manager people in the retail. I should not know that. I don't think that's public knowledge, but it's not. The point being, looking at who's how you're actually leveraging power in organizing. If you're if it's on the level of how will people inside these enormous companies make their oligarch CEOs bow down. That's, I think, a big part of it is having praxis and thinking about who are your people.
Is anybody confused? Does anybody not know what we're talking about? I'm just wondering. You guys, anybody have a question about it?
I'm specifically not aware of the petition at Amazon.
So Amazon petition, or an open letter to Jeff Bezos about the recognition facial rec program that they were doing with the police, and they, I think it was 100-ish people, so it was not that many people, and then I did some asking around, just who's actually signing this? Is this people who have very much social history? And Amazon's corporate social responsibility team isn't even allowed to audit Amazon Web Services. That's out of their purview. So I don't, I think that if we're gonna make this part of in terms of trying to hold them accountable, you have to think about who within the large fiefdoms that is the many fiefdoms of Amazon actually has power and influence. In this case, AWS is the only source of is the main source of real revenue the company makes. So if they don't care and if they're not going to walk,
But there have been successful.
There have been successful
insurgencies at Microsoft, Amazon, and Google, where workers have said we don't want our companies to participate in some of the things that are happening.
Just to say, part of that was also pressure from shareholders. And
Great.
I know in relating to the border wall project, some architecture firms were in the running for participating in the procurement process, and I have a friend who actually organized at the company he worked at, which is like a massive engineering architecture firm, but he got both workers but also got shareholders. And there's sort of this pressure from below and above that, in these sort of structures, the power of workers comes through organizing, but then also being strategic about knowing what can undercut, the actual business model. So
Yeah. So anybody out there from Thomson Reuters, we've got your back. We're there. We want to help you.
What was the name of the movement? It was really good.
Oh, not our wall.
Oh, not our wall.
Yeah.
All right. How about you guys?
Yeah, I mean, I want to kind of return to this question about like the problems inherent in decentralization and like recognize it's essentially a conservative ideology. It's something that capitalists love, and we should be really careful in sort of fetishizing it. Like the problem with Tahrir Square and Occupy Wall Street was like these management systems emerged without any political content, and they were destroyed by content. Any like good Marxist knows that before you sort of like dissolve the state into like worker control, you need a very strong, very centralized, mode of redistributing resources very intentionally and like recognizing the sort of like
Lesson that Robespierre learned.
yeah. And so I hope that we don't view decentralization as like the end goal, but rather like a momentary strategy or strategy that can be used throughout different movements to kind of like outskirt our adversaries, whether it's like the DMCA or like Comcast or whatever. We still need to like create a body, a union of workers in this country and in the world to swiftly, erase the damage that's been done over the last few hundred years and like establish something powerful.
It also feels that once like you're locked down in a structure and many cycles of that pass, it becomes corrosive, right? So we have to be kind of adaptive to.
Yeah.
Question for you. You spoke of your scientific research, and you said that for sure that's not correct.
Yes.
Could you expand upon how you know that is not correct as based upon your animal research? I found that fascinating.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that question. It's a long rabbit hole, so stop me whenever.
Okay, I might say let's do that. Let's first have Human and Drew answer the question of scale, and then you already answered. Oh yeah, you did. Drew.
Okay, so there's a few different threads I want to pull on now, but I think with the question of scale, which is going back to your question and Rory's question, especially in terms of infrastructure, like equipment and infrastructure, like if we're providing things like cellular service or telecommunications, there's a kind of responsibility that it's stable, right? And I think some concrete examples I can think of people who are really trying to solve the question of scalability on these local networks and these kind of federated networks, which is something I also want to talk about because it has to do with what Grayson just said. But like Giphy does something really interesting. They're like a community network in Catalonia, right? And what they do is they allow the resale of internet on their networks, kind of creating more of these ISPs within the network that kind of share into the system. So allowing that kind of growth and self-sustainability of these networks, I think, is an interesting strategy for real sustainability. Because you're right, like to build infrastructure takes a tremendous commitment and a ton of time and effort. It's hard. So yeah, scalability is real. And with regards to capitalism and fears and all this shit, like I was reading something today from the EFF, right? We, in theory, like the EFF. And they said something that kind of like pissed me off because it was just like they were framing the solution to to a free internet in terms of competition. If we could have more competition, the internet would be freer. Which is kind of bullshit because it's just like putting like this neoliberal frame around the problem of what's wrong with the internet without thinking about intent, right? Like, actually, really, it's competition and all this insane drive to make the most amount of money, which has led to us being in this situation that we are in with the internet. So I think like another way to look at this problem is something that Darshana said a little bit ago, which is intent, right? When we're building this stuff, let's have like an intention that isn't the bottom dollar, right? The bottom line. It's got to be something a little bit more interesting than that, and also like less harmful.
That's great. Okay, so now that we've all talked about scale, Darshana, would you please?
So much of this is kind of based on how inheritance is thought of, right? And the framing is that it's genetic and certain things are hardwired versus not. You have these genes passed across generations, and it's attributed to Darwin. Darwin himself would be shocked because he never thought about it that way. It was a reframing based on social and political context, which is like how much of science works is like it is also viewed through some kind of framework. And so I say it's wrong because there are actually multiple inheritance systems. Genetics is just one of them. There's cultural inheritance, for instance, or symbolic inheritance systems. These stories we tell ourselves, these narratives, these whatever, whether it comes in the form of science fiction or even the news or whatever, these that carry on across generations, they're passed on. We mix them up. Like the way we view the world is through these lenses, which then shapes how we behave. And so this is just this is a lens that in some sense was created.
As a scientist, so what percentage, just as you guess, is genetic as opposed to the stories that we tell ourselves, which is very germane to this discussion?
I think that's not a useful framework for analyzing things. The nature nurture framework is a totally not useful framework because you have a predisposition to something, but things trigger that disposition, and it can be, you can hit that trigger, you may not, and it can be very many other things. I don't know, random example, but like a dung beetle, the size of the dung beetle is not genetically determined, it's the size of the dung that it's born on, and it can be like a giant horned male that can reproduce or nothing at all, or like not. And so there's all of these other factors that can play in this, like a whole myriad of them which you can buffer yourself against, or sort of fall down a hole on in. And so given the whole sort of possibility, the better way to look at it is almost like a waterfall, where you have like ancient bedrocks put in, you have, a stone falls in, it could be some temporary change, or it could keep falling in and cause a more permanent change, and it could break off into two streams, and those could create different behaviors. So it's a much more dynamic system than this very sort of clean.
So you don't have a guess as to
there is none. It doesn't. That framework really does.
We'll have some time to chat after this. I just want to follow that beautiful waterfall analogy with thinking. I mean, so Rory, you brought up radio, right, in the 1890s, and what happened, which was the FCC was created to regulate radios on the argument that ships were going to crash at sea because there was nobody regulating the radio waves, so like nobody would get these emergency communications. That argument has been made many times. Ronald Coase made that argument. He's a great sort of early neoliberal thinker who brought us the idea that externalities are necessary, and that basically like we should all we as people should shoulder all the burden of externalities created by industry. So this kind of question of control comes back again and again and again, right? And even before radio, there was the telephone system, and there was the kind of, in Tim Wu's book, in The Master Switch, he talks about like all the millions of like different telephone systems that were out there, and the need, basically that Ma Bell was created to make sure that everybody could reach each other on the telephone. So we have a natural monopoly in telecommunications. It's been around since the 30s, right, because of all these things. And now with the internet, we're at another one of these moments where we're kind of struggling between control and the eruption of like insurgency, right, insurgent infrastructure. So, this question of intention, again, comes around, and I think that's the seed that hopefully we've planted with everybody, and I'm so glad that we've examined the question of decentralization as a principle, and asked that question of with intention, does it grow into an authoritarian control system, or does it grow into what another great neoliberal said, like a million flowers, right? Or like sort of how do we create something different, and how do we shape intention, which is also what Octavia Butler would say. God has changed.
It's one of the
Shape
best
change.
descriptions of God. I was like, oh, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Chaos and change.
So we started with infrastructure, and now we're at radical solidarity, God,
I feel like
and
insurgent infrastructure
revolution.
is like that's a good like band name in conference.
Yeah.
I'm down.
Also, Milquetoast Manifesto. That's a good band name. Yeah.
Clayton, do you have the last word? Is that what
I
you're?
just have one
Yeah.
quick thing to say. There's just three components to it. When you talk about infrastructure, and I think one thing that sometimes is a blind spot is people don't think about. In our neighborhood up in Harlem, 40% of people don't have broadband in the home, and a large part of them don't even have a device in the home. So you don't want to forget that it's important to get affordable devices in the home beyond a cell phone. And the second piece is we ought to explore the idea of community servers, cloud-based servers that are serving the community, because it's not about the equipment, it's about the content, right? In other words, people need the tools to get to what they need to do, whether it's to look for a job or finish a report or do whatever. And the infrastructure right now is built to where a lot of people don't have access to an Adobe Photoshop or an Adobe this or Microsoft Word or any of that. And I think it's important for the practitioners here to not leave that out of the discussion. Having connectivity is absolutely important. But the Erickson report says that the connectivity of a home that has no broadband can increase their household revenue by $500 a month. That's significant, it's life-changing. But if the home doesn't have a device, you can't get there. So we have to make sure that we look at this as a whole ecosystem. It can't just be limited to the fact that I can connect a router. It's got to have the infrastructure in the home. And you made a great point at the very beginning, which is we have to do digital literacy. Most of the community is illiterate, including some of us in this room don't even know the speed we're getting in our home. So we have to get much more literate in order to make the internet relevant. But trust me that people in certain areas and people who may not have gone on to college and got great degrees and can talk intellectually in a nice meetup are going, I can't wait to watch, the next show on television. That's what they're looking for.
Well, that's what we all, and I think that's also a good point, is that everybody, we all want to have fun too. It's, there's this idea that people who live in underconnected communities should use the internet to do their homework and get a job, and that's very condescending. So.
Just one, can I add one thing? Can we just ditch this universal income thing and have universal infrastructure? It just makes so much more sense.
Yeah.
Someone handing me $500. What am I going to do with it? And this world is
No,
expensive.
that's not what I said, but
No,
I agree with
but
you.
I'm saying,
though.
I'm adding to what you're saying.
Yeah.
That, your problem like that. Yeah, we should all.
I totally agree with that. Yeah.
So I think we should, if you guys want to continue and talk, we'll stick around for a minute, or I will, and I can't speak for these folks, but thank you all so much for being here tonight. Solidarity.
Thank you for your question. It's my favorite topic.
It was a fascinating